in a city that no longer exists. 1 million men fought for every brick. They weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival, for pride, for something to hold on to. When the world around them had turned to ash, every street became a battlefield. Every building, a fortress. Every heartbeat, a gamble with death. This wasn't just war. It was hell frozen over. And the name of that hell was Stalingrad. Summer of 1942. The war on the Eastern Front had stretched into its second brutal year. Hitler's blitzkrieg, once a lightning strike that shattered armies and nations, had faltered at the gates of Moscow. The once unstoppable German war machine had met the stubborn resilience of the Soviet Union, and for the first time, the Führer faced a campaign that would not bend easily to his will. Frustrated, Hitler turned his ambition southward. Beyond the frozen plains of Russia lay the oil-rich Caucasus, the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare. To seize it, the Germans needed one city, Stalingrad. A city that bore the name of their greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin himself. To Hitler, capturing Stalingrad was not only a strategic move but a symbolic one, a triumph over the man who had defied him, a conquest that would humiliate the Soviets and prove German invincibility. For Stalin, the stakes were no less personal. Stalingrad was more than an industrial hub, it was a city of pride, a symbol of Soviet endurance, and a critical node for transportation and supplies along the Volga River. Losing it would cut off vital supply lines and open a pathway for the Germans straight into the Caucasus. But Stalin would not allow it. He ordered the city to be defended at all costs. Retreat was forbidden. Every man, every soldier, every citizen was expected to hold the line, no matter the cost to life or limb. By August, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, began its advance toward the Volga. The Luftwaffe unleashed waves of bombers, reducing entire districts to rubble. Smoke rose like a black tide, and the cries of the dying mingled with the roar of artillery. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in the initial bombing alone, yet the Red Army refused to surrender. The survivors dug in, prepared to fight in the streets, in the ruins, and in every inch of the shattered city. Hitler believed Stalingrad would fall quickly. His generals had calculated a swift victory, expecting to sweep the city in weeks. But the Soviets were ready, resilient, and determined. The stage was set for one of the deadliest battles in human history, where every street, every building, every brick would be contested in a war of attrition that no one could have imagined. By the time the first German boots entered the city, Stalingrad had already become a battlefield unlike any other, a city transformed into a crucible where human endurance, courage, and horror would collide. What was supposed to be a campaign of conquest would soon become a nightmare of frozen streets, endless blood, and unimaginable loss. By September 1942, Stalingrad had become a city of rubble. What remained of its streets was a maze of shattered buildings, twisted steel, and cratered asphalt. Every step forward brought the Germans face to face with death. Fighting was no longer about strategy or formations, it was about inches, doors, stairwells, and basements. Soldiers clawed their way through ruined apartment blocks, exchanging fire with enemies hidden around every corner. Snipers turned chimneys, windows, and piles of debris into lethal perches. Among them, Vasily Zaitsev became a symbol of Soviet defiance, picking off German officers with a deadly patience that terrorized his foes. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, scavenging for scraps of food, drinking melted snow, and huddling in cellars where corpses lay as silent witnesses. The city was alive with gunfire, screams, and smoke, yet no one retreated. Every house, every brick, became a fortress, a grave, and a testament to the desperation and resilience of those who refused to surrender. And the worst was still to come. When winter descended on Stalingrad, it was as if nature itself had turned against the soldiers. The Volga froze solid. The wind cut through flesh like glass. Temperatures fell below -30 degrees, and the snow buried the ruins of the city, hiding the corpses beneath it. The German Sixth Army, which had once marched across Europe with confidence and precision, now found itself trapped in a nightmare. Supply lines stretched too far, and Soviet artillery severed the last lifelines from the west. The Luftwaffe tried to keep them alive by air, but what could a few scattered crates of food do against an army of 250,000 men? Inside the ruins, rations ran out. Soldiers boiled leather belts, ate frozen horse meat, even scraped flour from the floors of bombed-out warehouses. Frostbite took fingers before the enemy could. In the hospitals, if they could still be called that, men lay side by side on cold concrete, their breath forming clouds of despair in the air. The Soviets, too, suffered, but they had adapted. They were fighting for home, and they knew how to survive the Russian winter. For the Germans, this cold was alien, merciless, and absolute. Fuel froze inside tanks, guns jammed, and even morphine turned solid in its glass vials. The nights were endless. In the dark, both sides could hear each other, the coughs, the cries, the scraping of boots on snow. Death was close, constant, familiar. The Soviets tightened their grip. Day after day, artillery shells rained down. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the frozen ruins, shaking loose the last remnants of the city. German officers pleaded for retreat, but Hitler's voice thundered back through the radio. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad must be taken. But there was nothing left to take. The city was a graveyard. Men stopped fighting not because they were cowards, but because they had nothing left to give. Their bodies refused to move, their minds shut down under the weight of hunger and cold. Letters home were filled with quiet resignation. Some wrote about the frost that wouldn't leave their boots. Others spoke of dreams, dreams of warmth, of home, of food that no longer existed. Many never finished their sentences. In the Soviet trenches, things weren't much better. Food was scarce, ammunition short, and the cold bit through every layer of clothing. But their resolve was unbreakable. They knew what was at stake. Losing Stalingrad meant losing the war. As December turned to January, the line between soldier and corpse blurred. The living stepped over the dead to take shelter. The battlefield had become a frozen tomb. And yet, the fighting continued. Because by then, Stalingrad was no longer about victory, it was about endurance. Who could outlast the hunger, the cold, and the fear? Who could survive the end of the world? November 19, 1942. The dawn was quiet, too quiet. Then the earth began to shake. From the north and south of Stalingrad, the Red Army unleashed a storm that would change the course of the entire war. It was called Operation Uranus. In freezing winds and blinding snow, Soviet tanks and infantry surged forward, not against the German elite in the city, but against the weaker Romanian and Hungarian divisions guarding their flanks. Within days, those lines collapsed like glass under a hammer. Columns of Soviet armor raced westward, closing the jaws of a massive trap. By November 23, the circle was complete. The German Sixth Army, more than 250,000 men, was surrounded. They were cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and hope. What began as Hitler's great triumph now became his greatest disaster. When news of the encirclement reached the Führer's headquarters, he refused to believe it. Hitler declared that the Sixth Army would stand firm. They will fight where they are. The Air Force will supply them. But reality was merciless. The Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Fuel, food, and ammunition dwindled by the hour. Inside the frozen ruins, despair spread faster than frostbite. Soldiers rationed crumbs of bread and melted snow for water. Horses were slaughtered, not for transport but for meat. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as men stared blankly into nothing, too weak to fight, too numb to care. Letters home turned from hope to confession. "Mother," one soldier wrote, "we are finished. There is no escape. Only snow and silence." General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, begged Berlin for permission to break out while it was still possible. But Hitler's orders were absolute: no retreat. Not a step back. He promised that relief would come from the west, Operation Winter Storm, but that rescue force never broke through. As December passed, the circle around Stalingrad grew tighter. Soviet artillery thundered day and night. Each shell marked the slow death of an army once feared across Europe. Men burned their last maps for warmth. They ate soup made of wallpaper paste. Some even prayed for a bullet to end the suffering. By January, the German forces had been split into two pockets, both starving, both beyond saving. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal, a cruel gesture from Hitler, who expected him to take his own life rather than surrender. But Paulus didn't die. He refused to give his men one more corpse to follow. On January 31, 1943, Soviet troops stormed the command bunker beneath the ruins of a department store. The once proud general, pale and exhausted, surrendered. Around him, tens of thousands of soldiers laid down their weapons. In a final radio transmission to Berlin, a German officer's voice trembled through static. "The Russians are at the door. We are destroying our weapons. This is the end." And with those words, the fate of Stalingrad and of Hitler's empire was sealed. February 2, 1943. After 163 days of unrelenting battle, the guns of Stalingrad finally went silent. What remained was not victory, not defeat, but desolation, a city reduced to rubble, buried beneath the snow, and soaked in the blood of more than 1 million men. In the shattered streets where factories once roared, only silence remained. The proud Sixth Army of Germany, once the spearhead of Hitler's conquest, had ceased to exist. Of the 300,000 soldiers who entered Stalingrad, barely 91,000 survived to surrender. They emerged from cellars and ruins like ghosts, frostbitten and starving, their faces hollow, their eyes emptied of everything human. The Soviets gathered them in endless columns. The march into captivity began, miles upon miles through the snow, past the ruins they had once sworn to conquer. They trudged forward in tattered uniforms, many collapsing along the way, too weak to lift their feet. Those who fell were left where they lay, the white snow swallowing them as it had so many others. Only a fraction would ever see home again. Of the tens of thousands taken prisoner, fewer than 5,000 returned to Germany years later. The rest perished in Soviet camps from disease, hunger, and exhaustion. For them, Stalingrad did not end in February 1943, it lingered for years, in the slow death of captivity. For the Soviets, the cost was equally staggering. Their victory had been bought with over 1 million casualties, soldiers, workers, civilians, all swallowed by the Inferno. Entire neighborhoods were erased, entire generations scarred. The Volga River, once the city's lifeline, was now a graveyard beneath the ice. Stalingrad was a city of ghosts. Not a single building remained untouched. Of the 40,000 civilians who had once lived in its heart, barely a few thousand were left alive. They crawled from the ruins when the fighting stopped, half-starved, half-mad, searching for relatives who no longer existed. To the world, the fall of Stalingrad was a thunderclap. For the first time, the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht had shattered. The German army, which had marched through Europe unchallenged, was now in retreat, not just on maps, but in spirit. Across occupied Europe, people whispered a new word, Stalingrad. It meant resistance. It meant hope. It meant that Hitler could be defeated. Inside Germany, the shock was unbearable. Goebbels called for total war. Newspapers printed heroic lies about sacrifice and honor, but the truth could not be hidden. An entire army had vanished. Mothers received letters with no names, no explanations, only the cold announcement, missing in the East. Hitler himself refused to face the reality. He called the surrender a betrayal, accused Paulus of cowardice, and vowed revenge. But deep down, even he must have known, the tide had turned. From that moment on, Germany was no longer advancing, it was bleeding, retreating, falling apart piece by piece. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became legend, the symbol of defiance, of endurance, of a nation that refused to break. The Red Army's victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the great counteroffensive that would, 2 years later, end in Berlin. But the triumph carried a shadow. Those who survived carried memories too heavy to speak of friends frozen in the trenches, of nights filled with screams, of the smell of burning flesh in the snow. A Soviet nurse recalled, "When it was over, I looked around and realized there was no one left to cheer. Only silence. Only the wind." The city would take years to rebuild. Factories would rise again from the ruins, and life would eventually return. But beneath every foundation lay bones, soldiers, workers, children, all buried together in the same frozen earth. Stalingrad was not simply won. It was endured. It was suffered through, minute by minute, day by day, until there was nothing left to destroy. The aftermath was not a celebration, but a question: how far can humanity go before it ceases to be human? In the ruins of that city, the world saw both the best and the worst of itself, the unbreakable will to survive, and the unimaginable cruelty of war. For the soldiers who lived through it, the word Stalingrad would forever echo in their dreams, a place they could never leave behind. And for the world, it stood as a warning carved in stone and blood. That victory bought with so much death is no victory at all. When the smoke cleared over the ruins of Stalingrad, the world was no longer the same. The battle had ended, but something far greater had begun, a shift in the course of history itself. The defeat of the German Sixth Army was more than a military catastrophe, it was the breaking of an illusion. For years, the Wehrmacht had seemed unstoppable, marching across Europe with near-mythical precision. But Stalingrad exposed the limits of even the most disciplined army. From that moment on, the tide of World War II began to turn. The Red Army, hardened by months of street-to-street combat and brutal winter, seized momentum. Soviet forces pushed westward relentlessly, setting the stage for a counteroffensive that would eventually reach Berlin. Yet the cost was staggering: over 1 million dead, countless wounded, and a city flattened beyond recognition. Stalingrad became a symbol, not just of Soviet endurance, but of the unimaginable human cost of modern war. Soldiers, civilians, and children alike had been consumed in the flames. Victory and survival were measured not in territory, but in endurance. Even today, Stalingrad reminds the world of a simple, devastating truth: courage and resilience can endure even in the face of unimaginable horror, but the price of war is always paid in human lives.